In the heart of the American Revolution, far from the familiar battlefields of the East, a daring campaign unfolded on the wild frontier of the Illinois country. George Rogers Clark, a young Virginian officer, had a vision that the British wouldn't hold dominion over the American Midwest. He believed that securing the territories held by the British would shift the war's balance in favor of the Patriots. But this wasn't just some straightforward military maneuver. This campaign was a rugged, gritty backwoods adventure spanning hundreds of miles, with Clark's small, underfed, under-equipped force facing a relentless combination of brutal weather, challenging landscapes, and a formidable foe who would stop at nothing to retain control of the Western territories. Let's set the stage. By 1777, the Revolutionary War wasn't limited to a few scrappy colonial battles. It was shaping up to be a global conflict. The British, intent on holding North America, saw the Midwest as a vital territory. The Illinois country, stretching from modern Illinois and Indiana down through Kentucky, was a vast, rugged landscape. British forces stationed out of strategic forts like Fort Kaskaskia and Fort Vincennes wanted it as a launching pad for raids on Patriot settlers and to keep control over Native American alliances. And here's where Clark steps in. While Washington and his generals were dealing with the British on the eastern seaboard, Clark recognized that if the Americans didn't control the West, they'd be vulnerable from both sides. Securing these forts would cripple British influence over native tribes and disrupt British military strategies, preventing them from using this region as a staging ground. With a plan that was audacious, to say the least, Clark assembled a small group of around 175 frontiersmen and militiamen, convincing them that they could handle a mission that even the Continental Army would consider crazy. He sold the vision of a free American West, a land where they wouldn't have to fear British soldiers or Allied native forces raiding their homes. They set off from Fort Pitt in late spring of 1778, moving down the Ohio River in boats. But this wasn't your typical military parade. His men endured the muddy rivers, the dense forests, and the endless line of swamps, navigating this hostile terrain as they headed westward. With every mile they grew hungrier, colder, and more determined. By July 4, 1778, as Americans in the East celebrated Independence Day, Clark's band of rough-and-ready frontiersmen reached Kaskaskia, an isolated British fort in present-day Illinois. But here's the twist. They didn't barge in, guns blazing. Clark was cunning. Knowing he didn't have the numbers for a full-on assault, he relied on stealth and surprise. Under the cover of darkness, he and his men infiltrated Kaskaskia. In one stroke, they captured the fort, stunning the British forces there, who had no idea an American campaign was anywhere near them. He knew that if he was to maintain control of the Illinois country, he needed the support of the local French-speaking population. These settlers had previously been under French rule and were wary of the British. Clark cleverly positioned the Americans as liberators, emphasizing that they were fighting for the same freedom the French had long cherished. He promised the people their own rights, religious freedoms, and protection from British rule. Word spread quickly, and soon Clark wasn't just a military commander, he became a hero. The people of Kaskaskia were all in, supporting Clark's campaign by supplying his forces and even enlisting as scouts and guides through the unfamiliar terrain. But Clark knew the real test was yet to come. Fort Sackville at Vincennes, under the command of British Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton, known as the hair buyer for allegedly paying Native American allies for American scalps. Hamilton wasn't one to sit idly by. By late 1778, he learned about Clark's occupation of Kaskaskia, and he saw it as a threat. In December, he moved his own forces from Detroit to reinforce Fort Sackville, with plans to reclaim Kaskaskia and push Clark out for good. Clark realized he needed to act before Hamilton could launch a counterattack. The winter of 1778 to 79 was one of the harshest on record, but Clark knew he couldn't afford to wait. On February 6, 1779, he rallied his men, barely 170 of them, to begin a 180-mile trek through flooded plains, icy rivers, and freezing swamps to reach Vincennes. This march, known as the Winter Expedition, would go down in history as one of the most brutal campaigns of the war. Picture this, trudging through knee-deep icy waters for days on end, with no food and barely any dry clothing. By the time they reached Vincennes, Clark's men were exhausted, starving, and as the story goes, half dead. They'd become living symbols of grit and endurance. But Clark knew that if they failed, everything they'd fought for could be wiped away in an instant. By February 23rd, they arrived outside Vincennes. Hamilton and his men, hunkered down inside Fort Sackville, had no clue Clark and his ragged army had arrived. Using the last reserves of his men's strength, Clark staged an impressive display of force. He ordered his men to spread out and fire sporadically, making it appear as if they had Hamilton surrounded by a vast army. Clark then sent an audacious demand for surrender. Hamilton, understandably skeptical, declined, believing he could withstand whatever small band of men Clark had brought. But Clark's men continued to attack relentlessly, making it seem as if they were everywhere at once. It was psychological warfare at its best. When Hamilton finally peeked over the fort's walls and saw Clark's men advancing with such fierce resolve, he began to realize that he was facing a force that was more than just physical. These weren't ordinary soldiers. These were men who had walked through icy rivers and frozen swamps for days without breaking. After days of relentless pressure, on February 25, 1779, Hamilton finally surrendered. Fort Sackville, the linchpin of British power in the West, was now under American control. Clark's gamble had paid off. George Rogers Clark's campaign in the Illinois country wasn't just a battle for land. It was a battle for the very idea of American resilience. Clark's men were outnumbered, outgunned, and faced impossible odds, yet they achieved the unimaginable. This campaign demonstrated that the American cause wasn't confined to the well-trodden paths of the eastern colonies. It was a testament to the fact that the spirit of independence could and would extend across vast, untamed landscapes. After the war, Clark's success in the West would play a crucial role during the Treaty of Paris negotiations in 1783. The British conceded lands extending to the Mississippi River, much of it due to the territory Clark had secured. Although Clark himself would face personal and financial difficulties after the war, his campaign cemented him as a pivotal figure in the Revolution. The Illinois campaign shows us that history isn't just about battles on grand fields with large armies. Sometimes it's about a handful of determined people willing to endure unimaginable hardships for a cause they believe in. Clark's men may not have been part of the Continental Army, but their sacrifices and achievements are woven into the fabric of American independence. In the grand saga of the Revolutionary War, George Rogers Clark's campaign is a reminder that freedom often requires unimaginable sacrifice and grit. And sometimes, the quiet victories on the edges of the map end up shaping the destiny of a nation.